Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the sacred grounds where silence should reign eternal, yet the restless refuse to rest. In this episode we bring you 8 disturbing accounts of encounters within the hallowed corridors of our nation's cemeteries and graveyards. From the windswept headstones of Colorado to the moss-laden crypts of Louisiana, these testimonies emerge from individuals who dared to walk among the dead and discovered that some graves cannot contain what lies beneath. Each story has been reconstructed from detailed witness accounts, police reports, and first-hand testimonials of those who experienced the unexplainable in these places of eternal rest. The voices you will hear belong to groundskeepers who worked the midnight shift, visitors paying respects to loved ones, and investigators who stumbled upon phenomena that defied rational explanation. To preserve the dignity of the deceased and protect the privacy of the living witnesses, certain identifying details, including specific cemetery names and personal information, have been carefully altered. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that unearths the darkest corners of human experience. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we excavate another collection of buried truths that refuse to stay dead. The old man's hands were stained with decades of Colorado soil. Weathered fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as the autumn sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountain peaks. Calvin Brooks had been the caretaker of Hillcrest Cemetery for 37 years, and in all that time he had never spoken about what he witnessed on those crisp October nights when the veil between worlds grew thin. "You want to know about the lantern?" Calvin said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in silence. The shadows lengthened across the weathered headstones as he settled back in his wooden chair on the cemetery office porch. "Most folks around here, they heard the stories, but they never lived with it like I have." Calvin's weathered face turned toward the rows of granite markers that stretched into the gathering dusk. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the small mountain town of Silver Cliff, population barely 800 souls. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of festering in the thin mountain air until they became something else entirely. The kind of place where whispered conversations behind the post office carried more weight than headlines in the Denver papers. "Started back in 1987, Calvin continued, his breath visible in the cooling air. "October 15th to be exact. I remember because it was the night after old Martha Hendricks was laid to rest. She'd lived in this town for 93 years, never married, never had children, spent her whole life taking care of other people's business, knowing every secret, every shame, every buried truth this town tried to forget. Martha Hendricks had been the town librarian for 62 years, a position that gave her access to more than just books and periodicals. People trusted librarians with their private conversations, their hushed phone calls, their desperate searches through old newspaper archives. Martha had witnessed decades of cover-ups, lies told to protect reputations, and documents that mysteriously disappeared when they threatened powerful families. She kept meticulous records in her personal journal, documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained death, every family that suddenly left town. The first time Calvin saw the light, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been making his evening rounds, checking that the day's burial service had been properly cleaned up. The funeral director from Pueblo always left behind small messes that Calvin took pride in correcting. Scattered rose petals, folding chairs not properly stacked, programs blowing against headstones in the mountain wind. As he walked between the headstones, collecting forgotten flowers and straightening American flags, he noticed a soft glow emanating from somewhere near the back section of the cemetery. "Figured it was some kids with flashlights," Calvin explained, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "We get them. Sometimes teenagers thinking they're brave enough to spend a night among the dead. Usually they scatter like rabbits when they hear my boots crunching through the gravel. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't no flashlight. This light, it moved different. Had a quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand up, made my teeth ache like before a thunderstorm. The light appeared to be coming from an old-fashioned lantern, the kind with a glass chimney and metal frame that miners used to carry deep into the Colorado mountains. The brass fittings had developed a greenish patina, and the glass was clouded with age, yet the flame inside burned with intensity that seemed to come from another world entirely. It hovered about 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently as if carried by invisible hands. The warm yellow glow cast long shadows between the headstones, creating shapes that seemed to writhe and dance in Calvin's peripheral vision. Calvin approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. In all his years tending to the dead, he had never felt the kind of primal fear that gripped him in that moment. The temperature seemed to drop with each step he took toward the mysterious light, and the familiar sounds of the mountain evening, the rustle of aspen leaves, the distant call of an owl faded into unnatural silence. The lantern moved with purpose, following what appeared to be the old walking paths that connected different sections of the cemetery. Paths that had been established when the graveyard was first consecrated in 1892. Paths that most people had forgotten existed beneath decades of fallen leaves. The strangest part, Calvin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was that the light seemed to know where it was going. It would pause at certain graves, hover there for maybe 30 seconds, then move on to the next one. Always the same pattern, always the same graves, like it was reading something written on the headstones that I couldn't see. Over the following weeks, Calvin began to document which graves the lantern visited. He kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket, jotting down dates and times and locations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Every grave the lantern lingered over belonged to someone who had died with unfinished business in Silver Cliff. Martha Hendricks was just the beginning of a pattern that stretched back generations. There was Thomas Kellerman, who had died in a car accident in 1973. 3 days before he was supposed to testify in a corruption case involving the town's former mayor. His vehicle had skidded off Highway 24 in perfect weather conditions, crashing into a stand of aspen trees with suspicious force. Rebecca Walsh, who passed away from a heart attack in 1981 while investigating financial irregularities at the local bank. She had been 38 years old with no prior heart problems, found clutching a manila folder filled with evidence that disappeared before the coroner arrived. James Moreau, who died of pneumonia in 1958 after spending months trying to prove that his business partner had been embezzling funds from their mining operation. Each one of them died before they could expose the truth about something, Calvin said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Each one of them took secrets to their graves that could have changed this town forever. Could have saved other people from being cheated, lied to, maybe even killed. The lantern appeared every night for 3 weeks straight. Calvin found himself drawn to watch its nightly journey, following at a respectful distance as it moved between the headstones. The October air grew colder each evening, frost beginning to form on the marble angels and granite crosses. He began to notice that the light grew brighter on certain nights, particularly when the wind carried voices from town up the hill to the cemetery. Voices arguing behind closed doors, voices making deals in dark alleyways, voices covering up truths that needed to be spoken. On those nights, the lantern would pulse with urgent rhythm, as if responding to the corruption that continued to poison the town below. On November 7th, exactly 23 days after Martha Hendricks was buried, the lantern's behavior changed. Instead of following its usual route through the cemetery, it moved directly to Calvin's office. It hovered outside his window, casting that warm yellow glow across his desk, where he kept his documentation of the nightly visits. The light pulsed gently as if trying to get his attention, as if it had something urgent to communicate. Calvin opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The lantern hung in the air just beyond his reach, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. For the first time since the appearances began, Calvin felt no fear. Instead, he felt profound sadness, as if the light itself was mourning for all the truths that would never be told, all the justice that would never be served, all the innocent people who had suffered because good people had died too soon. "I understood then," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. The lantern wasn't trying to scare anybody. It was trying to remind us that some debts don't get settled just because someone dies. Some promises don't get broken just because the person who made them is 6 feet under. The next morning, Calvin walked into the Silver Cliff Police Department and handed over his notebook. Every entry, every observation, every pattern he had documented during those 3 weeks of nightly visits. He told Chief Morrison about Martha Hendricks' investigation into the town's missing municipal funds, about the ledger she had hidden in the library basement. He explained how Thomas Kellerman had discovered evidence of vote manipulation in the 1972 mayoral election. He detailed Rebecca Walsh's findings about the systematic overcharging of elderly customers at Morrison's family-owned bank. Chief Morrison listened to every word, Calvin continued, didn't interrupt once. When I finished talking, he closed my notebook and told me he'd look into it. 2 days later, he arrested his own uncle for embezzlement. 3 days after that, they found the missing municipal funds in an account belonging to the former mayor's widow. The arrests didn't stop there. Within a month, half the town council had been indicted for corruption. Property that had been illegally seized was returned to rightful owners. Families who had been cheated out of insurance settlements finally received justice. The truth had a way of spreading once it was allowed to breathe. The lantern appeared one final time on November 15th, exactly 1 month after Martha Hendricks was buried. Calvin watched from his office window as it made its usual rounds, pausing at each grave where it had lingered before. But this time was different. At each stop, the light seemed to pulse 3 times, like a signal or farewell. When it reached Martha's grave, it hovered there for nearly 10 minutes before slowly fading away, leaving behind the faintest scent of kerosene and mountain wildflowers. Calvin finished his coffee as full darkness settled over the cemetery. The mountain air carried the scent of approaching snow, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. The familiar sounds of the Colorado evening had returned. The whisper of wind through pine branches, the distant rumble of a freight train crossing the valley. "Never saw the light again after that night," he said, standing slowly from his chair. "But I learned something important. Sometimes the dead don't rest because the living won't listen. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to finish what was started, even if it takes 37 years and a mysterious lantern to show you the way." Calvin gathered his empty coffee cup and turned toward his small cottage at the edge of the cemetery grounds. "The dead have their own sense of justice," he called back over his shoulder. "And in Silver Cliff, justice has a way of finding the light." As Calvin disappeared into the gathering darkness, a soft breeze rustled through the pine trees that bordered the cemetery. For just a moment, just long enough to make a person wonder, a faint yellow glow seemed to flicker between the headstones before vanishing into the Colorado night. Some say that on clear autumn evenings, when corruption threatens to take root in Silver Cliff again, the lantern still appears to those who know how to look. "Drive faster, Lily. She's still there," Marcus shouted from the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard. The speedometer needle climbed past 70 as Lily Ramirez pressed harder on the accelerator, her Honda Civic racing down Archer Avenue through the dark Illinois countryside. "I'm trying," Lily's voice cracked as she checked the rearview mirror. Behind them, the iron gates of Resurrection Cemetery grew smaller, but the image of what they had witnessed burned bright in both their minds. The pale figure in the white dress standing motionless in their headlights before vanishing like morning mist. It had started as a dare 3 hours earlier. Lily's co-workers at the Chicago Tribune had been sharing ghost stories during their late shift, and someone mentioned the legend of Resurrection Mary, the phantom hitchhiker who supposedly haunted the stretch of road between the Willowbrook Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois. Marcus, who worked in sports and had been trying to ask Lily out for months, volunteered to drive with her to investigate. "It's probably just local folklore," Lily had said, gathering her notebook and camera. At 26, she had built a reputation as a skeptical journalist who specialized in debunking urban legends. But it might make for an interesting Halloween feature. Now, as they put distance between themselves and the cemetery, Lily was questioning everything she thought she knew about the supernatural. Her hands trembled as she finally slowed the car, pulling into a 24-hour diner in nearby Burbank. "Tell me what you saw," Lily said once they were seated in a corner booth, both nursing cups of black coffee. The fluorescent lights felt reassuring after the darkness of Archer Avenue, but neither could shake what had happened. Marcus ran his hands through his dark hair. "Same thing you saw. We were driving past the cemetery around midnight, and there she was, standing right in the middle of the road wearing that white ball gown. You hit the brakes so hard I thought we were going to slide into her." Lily nodded, replaying the scene. She had been driving the speed limit when the figure appeared in their headlights. A young woman with pale skin and dark hair wearing an elaborate white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. She had been standing perfectly still, not moving to get out of the way, showing no fear at the approaching vehicle. "But when I got out to check on her," Lily continued, "she was gone. Completely gone. And the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. That was the part that disturbed Lily most. As a journalist, she was trained to observe details, to look for logical explanations. But there had been nowhere for the woman to hide. The road was straight with open fields on both sides. No trees, no buildings, no ditches deep enough to conceal a person. The woman had simply vanished. My grandmother used to tell stories about Resurrection Mary," Marcus said quietly. "She grew up in this neighborhood back in the 40s. Said her older sister claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker on Archer Avenue one night. Beautiful girl in a white dress who asked to be taken to the cemetery. When they got there, the girl just disappeared from the back seat. Over the next week, Lily threw herself into researching the legend. She spent hours in the Chicago Public Library archives looking through old newspaper clippings and police reports. What she found surprised her. The stories went back decades with dozens of documented encounters involving a female hitchhiker who matched the same description. The earliest report she could find was from 1939, when a taxi driver claimed to have picked up a young woman outside the Willowbrook Ballroom. The woman, dressed in a white ball gown, asked to be taken to Resurrection Cemetery. When they arrived, she vanished from the back seat without paying the fare. The driver insisted he had locked the doors and never heard them open. Similar stories appeared in police reports throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Always the same pattern. A young woman in white, picked up along Archer Avenue asking to go to the cemetery, then vanishing without explanation. Some witnesses described her as warm to the touch and completely solid. Others said she felt cold and seemed to glow faintly. Lily interviewed retired Chicago police officers who had worked the area during the height of the sightings. Detective Raymond Kowalski, now 78, remembered taking multiple reports about the mysterious hitchhiker during his career. "We always took the calls seriously," Kowalski told her during an interview at his South Side home. "Most of the witnesses were solid citizens. Business people, nurses getting off late shifts, couples driving home from dates, not the type to make up stories." The detective showed Lily a file he had kept from his active duty days, filled with witness statements and incident reports. One case from 1976 particularly caught her attention. A young man named David Martinez had reported picking up a female hitchhiker on Archer Avenue around 11:30 at night. "She was standing by the side of the road near the cemetery entrance," Martinez had told police. "Beautiful girl, maybe 20 years old, wearing a white formal dress. She seemed upset, like she'd been crying. When I asked where she needed to go, she just said home and pointed toward the cemetery." Martinez described driving the woman to the cemetery gates, where she asked him to stop. When he turned to ask if she needed help getting inside, she was gone. The passenger door was still closed and locked, but the seat was empty. Martinez had immediately driven to the nearest police station to report the incident. "The strange thing," Detective Kowalski explained, "was that Martinez mentioned the girl felt cold when she got in the car. Not just cool skin, but actually cold, like she'd been standing outside in winter weather. But it was July, and the temperature that night was in the 80s. Lily found similar details in other witness accounts. The mysterious woman always felt unnaturally cold to the touch. She rarely spoke beyond asking to go to the cemetery or simply saying home, and she invariably disappeared when the vehicle reached the cemetery gates, leaving no trace except for the lingering scent of roses and vanilla." The most compelling evidence came from a 1983 incident that had been photographed by accident. A couple returning from their wedding reception had stopped to help what they thought was a stranded motorist near Resurrection Cemetery. The bride had taken several pictures to document their special day. When the film was developed, one photograph showed a figure in white standing near the cemetery gates, but the woman who had flagged them down was nowhere to be seen. The image was grainy and unclear, but it clearly showed someone in an old-fashioned white dress where no such person should have been visible. Lily spent an afternoon at the cemetery, walking the grounds and talking to groundskeepers. The cemetery, established in 1904, contained thousands of graves dating back over a century. She found several graves of young women who had died in the 30s and 40s, any one of whom could potentially match the description of Resurrection Mary. One grave in particular caught her attention. Anna Maria Norcus, who had died in 1927 at the age of 22. According to cemetery records, Anna had been killed in a car accident while returning home from a dance at the O'Henry Ballroom, which later became the Willowbrook Ballroom. She had been wearing a white beaded dress when she died and was buried in the same gown. "The timing fits," Lily told Marcus as they sat in her apartment, surrounded by research materials. "The first reported sightings of Resurrection Mary began about 12 years after Anna's death. And the location matches perfectly. She died on Archer Avenue, not far from where people claim to see the hitchhiker." 2 weeks after their encounter, Lily decided to return to Archer Avenue. This time she went alone, armed with a digital camera and voice recorder. She wanted to approach the investigation objectively without emotional influence. She parked near the cemetery entrance around 11:30, the same time most sightings were reported. The October night was clear and cold, with a full moon casting long shadows across the roadway. Lily sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching and waiting. At 12:15, she saw headlights approaching from the direction of the Willowbrook Ballroom. A pickup truck slowed as it passed the cemetery, then came to a complete stop about 50 yards ahead. The driver got out and walked to the passenger side of his vehicle, opening the door as if letting someone out. Lily started her engine and drove closer, pulling alongside the truck. The driver, a middle-aged man in work clothes, looked confused and frightened. "Did you see where she went?" he asked Lily through her open window. "Where who went?" "The girl I picked up back at the ballroom. Young lady in a white dress. She asked me to bring her here, to the cemetery. But when I stopped to let her out, she was gone. Doors still locked, but the seats empty." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She had just witnessed the Resurrection Mary phenomenon from a different perspective, seeing another driver experience exactly what she and Marcus had encountered 2 weeks earlier. "This has happened before," Lily told the man, introducing herself as a journalist. "You're not crazy, and you're not the first person to experience this." The man, who identified himself as Robert Chen, a construction worker from nearby Oak Lawn, seemed relieved to hear that others had similar experiences. He described the hitchhiker exactly as Lily remembered her. Young, pale, wearing an elaborate white dress with dark hair styled in vintage waves. "She seemed so real," Chen said. "We talked during the drive. She told me her name was Mary and that she was trying to get home. Her hands were ice cold when I helped her into the truck, but I figured she'd been waiting outside for a while." Lily interviewed Chen for over an hour, documenting every detail of his encounter. His story matched the historical reports almost perfectly, adding another piece to the puzzle of Resurrection Mary. 3 months later, Lily published her article about Resurrection Mary in the Chicago Tribune Sunday edition. She presented the historical evidence, the witness testimonies, and her own experience with journalistic objectivity, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. The article generated hundreds of responses from readers who claimed to have had similar encounters along Archer Avenue. Some described picking up the mysterious hitchhiker, others reported seeing her walking alone near the cemetery. A few readers shared family stories that had been passed down for generations, adding to the rich folklore surrounding the phantom of Resurrection Cemetery. But for Lily, the most significant outcome was personal. The experience had challenged her skeptical worldview and opened her mind to possibilities she had never considered. She continued to investigate paranormal phenomena throughout her career, always approaching each case with the same rigorous methodology she had applied to the Resurrection Mary story. And sometimes, on clear October nights when the moon is full, Lily still drives down Archer Avenue past the cemetery gates. Not as a skeptical journalist looking to debunk a legend, but as someone who knows that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some stories are too powerful to be explained away, and some spirits refuse to rest until they find their way home. The letter arrived pressed beneath a bouquet of dried magnolia leaves, edges browned and curling from the Louisiana heat. It was addressed to Miss Clara Everett, Ashland, Oregon, in a slanted, looping hand that immediately brought a lump to her throat. Just the sight of the return address, Maplewood Cemetery Office, St. James Parish, Louisiana, made Clara clutch the envelope with trembling fingers. Miles Everett had been the caretaker of Maplewood for almost 12 years, ever since his father's death. That cemetery was old in the way only southern cemeteries could be, with wrought iron arches, mausoleums buckling under strangler vines, and statues with watching eyes. Miles was younger than most caretakers, 41, broad-shouldered, with a battered Red Sox cap he wore in every season, and a way of moving that suggested he had never forgotten to check over his shoulder. He wrote to his sister when the weight of his job pressed too hard on his chest, and some buried family secret threatened to burst forth like a yellow jacket's hive beneath the grass. Clara, reading his letter from 1,000 miles away, heard the tremor in her brother's words. It was more pronounced this time, and as she read, she kept brushing at an imagined tickle along her forearms, the kind that comes when the air gets heavy before a southern storm. "Dear Clara, last night the statues started whispering again. It had been 2 years since the last time. You remember what I wrote then? The night after we put Father in the ground and I was sitting by the old Carter mausoleum thinking about what you said about moving north. I heard the bronze angel by the east gate murmur my name. Everett, she said, so soft I thought it was the wind in the Spanish moss. But pretty soon every angel, cherub, and draped lady in that half-acre started in, hissing words I could not understand, all at once until I had to press my hands to my ears. Clara, I thought I was losing my mind. I checked every inch of the cemetery by lantern light, found nothing but my own footprints in the dew. But last night, it was worse. It started at dusk. I was by the Grant plot, pruning the wild blackberries from around the iron rail. There was a breeze, just enough to rustle the leaves, and then I heard it. Whispers clear as day this time, like stone lips pressed against the air. It was not just one statue, but many, chiming in one after the other, names and dates, and then... He paused in the letter with a long blank space as if trying to protect her from what came next. Clara found herself holding her breath. One of them said your name. It was not my voice, and it was not anything human, but it said Clara, sure as sunrise. It called to me 3 times before it stopped. You must believe me, I am not making this up. I have kept myself alert, writing down times and locations, documenting the events like an investigator. Even took the old tape recorder you sent me for my birthday and turned it on during my rounds. I will mail you the cassette if you want, but I can hardly bear to hear it myself. I know you are thinking of Father, how his mind went toward the end. But this is real. The groundskeeper's dog would not come within 100 yards after dark. I found the candles I set at the grave sites blown out, stands knocked over as if by a strong, directed wind, though the air was still all evening. The sheriff dropped by at sundown, asking after stories of stolen flowers. The neighbors down on Chapel Street had complained, said they kept hearing what sounded like a woman singing after midnight, coming from among the graves. I do not know what to do, Clara. Something is wrong in Maplewood. Your brother, Miles. Clara read those words over and over, searching for reason in the gaps. The image of her brother out at dusk with only his lantern and the iron gates behind him brought back the worst of their childhood memories. Their father standing watch on their old porch, hammer in hand, muttering about shadows that move on their own, and their mother insisting on prayers for restless souls. She had always dismissed it as the superstition of old Louisiana, no more substantial than the stories traded at the corner store. She called Miles the next morning. The phone rang for a long time before his weary voice answered. He sounded older than she remembered, gravelly and slow, as if sleep had not come for days. I am telling you because no one else would believe it, he said before Clara could ask. It is not just noises or flickering shadows. The statues move, only when you are not looking directly. I catch them out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes they are looking at me when before they face the road. Sometimes a hand is extended that was never sculpted before, or a mouth open where there was none. I have pictures, I can send them, he did later that afternoon. The images arrived by email. Each photo showed some subtle, unexplainable shift. The mourning angel beside the Mayfield grave with a different set of rosaries in her folded hands. The marble cherub whose face bore fresh streaks as if from spent tears. She studied them late into the night, comparing them to the cemetery's archived photos. The differences were undeniable. Miles began to call Clara nightly. Every evening as dusk settled, so too did his dread. He could not bring himself to quit his job. The Everetts had been caretakers for generations. Instead, he documented everything. On the 3rd night, he told her about the dream. I was standing in the center of the cemetery, looking at the rows of statues. It was twilight, the hour when the solar lights flicker on. All the statues, every one of them, turned to face me at once. They spoke not in English but in voices like wind through iron gates and rain on stone. I woke up in a sweat, and when I went outside, every single statue was facing the main path. That has never happened before. I rotated a few of them back myself, but in the morning they were all turned forward again. Word got out among the locals that something was wrong at Maplewood. The sheriff's deputies began refusing to patrol the cemetery at night, and the groundskeeper quit after his dog refused to go near the east gate, howling at nothing and clawing madly at the chain-link fence. The florist who supplied bouquets for the old family's tombs found her arrangements wilting overnight, petals blackened as if burned by acid. Rumors spread, stories of children gone missing a century before, of deals made with voodoo priests and broken oaths by the first settlers. The priests at St. James would not come to bless the grounds, even when Miles offered double their usual fee. "The dead are uneasy," one old priest said, not meeting Miles's eyes. "Something is unfinished here." Even the city tried to avoid the place, blaming the strange happenings on sulfur vents under the marsh and magnetic anomalies. But the local news, sniffing a story, sent a young reporter to Maplewood to spend the night for a Halloween segment. He left before midnight, pale and tight-lipped, refusing to speak to anyone for a week. Clara scoured archives and newspaper records from across the state. All she found was the cemetery's strange history, an unclaimed mausoleum moved stone by stone from another county, a rash of vandalized statues in the late 1950s, a string of thunderstorms that had felled the oldest oak tree and split several grave markers. She called a retired professor from Tulane, an expert on Louisiana folk traditions. "Whispering statues? That is a story for the bayous," the professor said. "Older than any written record. It means the dead want something. The statues, they say, can become vessels for unspoken wishes, regrets, unfinished truths, especially where the earth is soft and the water runs near. If the whispers turn to wailing, leave and do not turn back." Meanwhile, Miles kept sending letters to his sister. Diagrams of statue placements, lists of names the statues seemed to whisper, and disturbing sketches of a particular figure. A pale, androgynous angel, crack running down one cheek, standing atop a square marble plinth at the heart of the oldest row. "Every night, that angel turns more and more towards the house," he wrote. "Last night I thought I heard it whisper Everett again. You should not come down here no matter what. I am trying to do some research before I go to the city officials. Something is not right with that statue." Several nights later, Miles called Clara, voice breaking. "Clara, tonight the whispering turned to pleading. I swear they said, 'Let us rest. Find the key. Let us rest.' Over and over. It was so loud I thought the neighbors would wake and come running. I walked through the rows until I reached the old communal crypt, the one with the locked iron door nobody has the key for. As I got close, the voices stopped all at once. The angel atop the crypt almost looked like it smiled. Clara pressed him for details. "What key? Did you ever find a key when Father died?" "Nothing like that. But I will look through the old desk in the office. If I find anything, I will call." That night turned to morning, then another sleepless day. At dusk, another letter came. "Clara, I found the key, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Father's desk drawer. There was a note tied to it in his writing. When the voices rise, return what was taken. I think I understand. Decades ago, a section of the cemetery was walled off during an epidemic. The city removed remains and reburied them in the communal crypt, but the records say not all personal effects were returned. Old superstition says the spirits would not rest unless all that was taken from them was given back. I am going to the crypt at midnight, alone." "Your brother?" Miles. Clara tried to call. No answer. Panicked, she called the sheriff, but the deputies, remembering the other night's whistling, refused to go, promising only to check at dawn. The next day, a single voicemail from Miles appeared on her phone, time-stamped 1:12 a.m. The static was so thick it scraped her ears. Through the distortion, she heard her brother's breath, ragged and fast, and a low chorus in the background, voices building and falling like the tide. Then, his whisper, "I am back at the crypt. The statues are all around me. The key fits. I am going to open it now, Clara," and then screaming metal, a sound like shifting stone, and the call cut out. He was gone. No one had seen him leave. The groundskeeper found the old communal crypt door standing open, nothing disturbed inside except for a pile of small ancient trinkets, beads and lockets, watches and pins, all laid out in the shape of a cross. The angel atop the tomb now faced away from the path and towards the swamp, its expression peaceful for the first time in living memory. Days passed. Then one evening, as the sun slipped behind the moss-draped branches, Clara received a final letter. The envelope was old and the edges soot-stained, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her brother's hand. "Clara, all is quiet now. The statues do not whisper anymore. I am safe, or as safe as one can be on holy ground. The dreams are gone. I hope you never have to see what I saw. If ever you need to find me, come to Maplewood at dusk and listen. The statues will only whisper welcome. Your brother, Miles." To this day, visitors to Maplewood Cemetery sometimes report as twilight falls that the statues seem to shift ever so slightly. Their lips pursed as if holding a silent message, their stone hands poised as though about to beckon. And if they listen very closely on certain humid Louisiana evenings, they say you can almost catch a gentle sigh across the crypts. A whisper of thanks, of peace, finally, found. I need to write this down while it's still fresh because honestly, I don't know if I'll believe it myself tomorrow. I'm sitting in my hotel room, hands still shaking, and I can't get the image out of my head. Today I decided to take that cemetery tour I've been putting off. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the one everyone calls the most haunted place in New Orleans. Perfect for my Halloween content series, right? The tour was supposed to end at 4 p.m., but I convinced the guide to let me stay behind for solo photos. Big mistake. Earlier today, 2:30 p.m. The tour group was typical. 15 tourists with cameras, college kids trying to look unimpressed, and one guy who kept asking if we'd see Marie Laveau's ghost. Our guide, Patricia, was this tiny Creole woman in her 60s who knew every story about every tomb. She kept warning us not to wander off and definitely not to stay after dark. The dead in St. Louis number 1, they don't all rest easy, she said, stopping in front of a crumbling above-ground vault. Some of them still got business with the living. I was getting great shots, afternoon light filtering through massive oak trees, weathered marble angels, elaborate ironwork like black lace against white tombs. This place is like a miniature city of the dead, with narrow pathways between vaults that rise up like tiny houses. Patricia told us about famous residents, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, whose tomb is covered in X marks from visitors seeking her help. But she also told darker stories about yellow fever epidemics that filled the cemetery faster than graves could be dug. The cemetery closes at 3 p.m. sharp, Patricia warned as the tour ended. Security locks the gates and you don't want to be trapped in here after sunset. 4:15 p.m. after the tour. I convinced Patricia I was a travel blogger and asked to stay 30 more minutes for photos. She looked at me like I'd asked to spend the night in a haunted house. Child, I've been giving tours here for 23 years. When that sun starts going down, you get yourself to the exit gate. But I'm stubborn. My followers expect authentic content, right? I convinced the security guard, showed him my press credentials, promised I'd be out by 5 p.m. He reluctantly agreed but made me sign a waiver. The moment the tour group left, the atmosphere changed. It was still daylight, but shadows between the tombs seemed deeper. I was alone among hundreds of graves, and for the first time, that felt significant. 5 p.m. The encounter. I was photographing Marie Laveau's tomb when I heard crying. Soft at first, like someone trying to muffle their sobs. The crying got louder, coming from deeper in the cemetery. I followed the sound, thinking maybe someone else had gotten permission to stay late. That's when I saw her. She was the steps of a white marble tomb, hunched over with her face in her hands. She wore a long white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Lots of lace, long sleeves, a full skirt that pooled around her feet. Her hair was dark and long, hanging loose around her shoulders. What struck me first was that she was barefoot. Her feet were dirty, like she'd been walking on unpaved ground for hours. "Are you okay?" I called out. The crying stopped immediately. She looked up at me and my heart stopped. Her face was beautiful but wrong somehow. Too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were dark and seemed too large for her face, but it was her expression that made me want to run. Such profound sadness that tears sprang to my own eyes. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was soft with an accent I couldn't place. Not quite Creole, not quite French, but something older. "The sun is setting." I looked around. She was right. Somehow the light had faded to golden hour. Long shadows stretched between tombs. "I'm just finishing up some photos," I said. "Are you visiting someone?" She stood up slowly, and I noticed she moved like she was floating. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone steps. "I am always here," she said. "I wait for those who do not listen to warnings." Something in her tone made my skin crawl. I took a step back, suddenly very aware that I was alone in a cemetery with someone who might not be stable. "I should go. The cemetery is closing soon." "Soon?" She tilted her head, and in the fading light her face seemed to shift. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin like old parchment. But then she was beautiful again, just incredibly sad. "The cemetery closed an hour ago," she said. "The gates are locked. You are trapped here until dawn." My blood went cold. I pulled out my phone to call the security guard, but there was no signal. "That's not possible," I said. "The guard knows I'm here." She shook her head slowly. "He left. They always leave before dark. No one stays in St. Louis number 1 after sunset. No one living." I started walking quickly toward the front of the cemetery, but the paths seemed different, longer, more twisted. The crying woman followed me, her bare feet silent on stone. "You should have listened," she said, keeping pace effortlessly. "Patricia warned you. She always warns them, but some never listen." "Who are you?" I asked. "I am what happens to those who stay too long. I am the warning that comes too late." I reached the front gate and rattled the iron bars, locked tight. The security booth was dark and empty. The woman stood behind me, and when I turned around, she was crying again. But now, in the last light of day, I could see that her tears were black. "Every night I wait here," she whispered. "Every night someone new joins me." I looked around desperately. The cemetery was much larger than it had seemed during the tour. Paths stretched in directions that hadn't existed before, and everywhere in the shadows between vaults I could see pale figures moving. "How do I get out?" I asked. "You don't. Not until dawn, but dawn is many hours away." 10:30 p.m. Still here. I've been writing this on my phone to keep myself sane. The battery is at 12%, but I need to document this. The crying woman was right. I'm trapped here until sunrise. She disappeared around 7 p.m., just faded away like mist. But I'm not alone. There are others here. shadows that move between tombs, whispers in languages I don't recognize. I found a sheltered spot between two large mausoleums. Every time I try to explore, the paths seem to shift. I end up back where I started. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees. My breath is visible, which is impossible for October in New Orleans. 2:15 a.m. Something's changed. The crying woman is back. She's sitting on Marie Laveau's tomb now, and she's not alone. There are others, men in old-fashioned suits, women in Victorian dresses, children in clothes from decades past. They're all sitting on various tombs, all perfectly still, all watching me. None of them are solid. I can see through them to the marble behind, but their eyes are so real, so full of sorrow. The crying woman beckoned to me. Against every instinct, I walked over to her. "You understand now," she said. "This place holds more than bodies. It holds the last moments of grief, the final tears of mourning. We are the sorrow that soaked into these stones over 2 centuries. What do you want from me? To witness, to remember, to carry our stories back to the living world. Too many come here seeking thrills. They don't understand that we were people once. We had names, lives, loves, losses." She told me her story then. Her name was Celeste Trem, and she had died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. She was 19 years old, engaged to be married in 2 weeks. She died alone in a charity hospital while her fiancé was traveling, and by the time he returned, she had already been buried in a mass grave. "I have been waiting here ever since," she said. "Waiting for someone to remember my name, to know that I existed, that I loved and was loved." The other spirits began to speak then, one by one. Each had a story, a name, a life cut short. They weren't trying to scare me, they were trying to be remembered. 5:45 a.m. Dawn approaches. The eastern sky is starting to lighten. The spirits are beginning to fade. Celeste is the last to go. "You will leave now," she said. "The gate will open with the sunrise. But you will remember us, yes? You will tell their stories." I promised I would. As the first real light of dawn touched the tombs, I heard the click of the front gate unlocking. The fog lifted and the paths returned to their normal layout. I walked out of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 and into the awakening French Quarter. I looked back once. The cemetery looked ordinary in the morning light. Just an old graveyard full of weathered tombs. But I could still feel their eyes on me, still hear the echo of Celeste's voice asking me to remember. Final thoughts. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I have no photos of the spirits. Every picture I took after sunset shows only empty tombs and shadows. But I have their names, their stories, their final requests. Maybe that's what really haunts places like St. Louis No. 1. Not malevolent ghosts seeking revenge, but forgotten souls seeking remembrance. The weight of stories untold, lives unrecorded, love and loss that soaked into the very stones. If you ever visit St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, please remember, these weren't just bodies laid to rest. They were people with stories worth telling, lives worth remembering. And maybe if you listen closely enough in the fading light of day, you might hear their whispers asking you to carry their memories back to the world of the living. They warned Detective Samuel Hutchins about Union Cemetery even before he took the job. On his first morning in Easton, the older officers snickered as they poured their coffee, jostling for an unobstructed view of the man from the city who thought a small-town police force would mean quiet finishes. "You'll be making house calls on raccoons after midnight if you're lucky," the sergeant said. "But sooner or later you'll pull an all-nighter at Union. That place does not like to be ignored." Samuel brushed off the tales at first. He was in his 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a thick New England accent. He had worked too many years in Bridgeport's violent crime unit to buy into white lady tales and whispers of vengeful spirits. He clung to routine, interviews, evidence bags, chain of command. Yet Union Cemetery had its own hold on the town, a reputation built from missing time and sudden chills, from bad luck wrecks on Stepney Road, from things that happened between the headstones at night that nobody wanted to name. The file landed on his desk in October, 100-year-old pages worn thin at the folds. Disappearances, unsolved deaths, ritual vandalism, marked by the signature crimson blooms of wild ivy, wound through the ornate iron fence that ringed the grounds. Initial crime scene, October 5th. That morning, Samuel was summoned by a frantic call from an elderly groundskeeper. Ivy's red, blood red, all up the Coleman family vault. Somebody's cut themselves, or worse, he arrived to find a strange, disturbing scene. Scarlet-stained vines encircled the Coleman crypt, twisting between the stone letters of beloved names. At their roots, the ground seemed freshly disturbed, though the cemetery had seen no burials in months. Despite the evidence of recent digging and something oddly sticky at the base of the stone, no bodies were found. Just a faded photograph of a young woman, on the back in painstaking cursive, "I'm sorry. Help me rest," locals clustered along the gate watching Samuel work. They did not murmur or ask questions. He got the sense they feared the answer. "Bad luck runs in ivy season," the oldest among them finally muttered. "It grows darkest where blood has been spilled, and it never leaves until the wrongs are buried for good." That evening, Samuel began his report with unusual trepidation. Union Cemetery Case File 1079. October 5th, 2018. Heavily disturbed soil at family crypt. Red-stained ivy. No sign of trespassers. Photograph of deceased placed with visible care. Possible vandalism? Locals extremely agitated. Recommend midnight patrol shifted to cemetery for next 2 weeks. Monitor for further disturbances. Midnight patrols. Field notes. Union Cemetery changed after sunset. The iron fence, ornate and rusting, seemed taller somehow, enclosing the headstones like stern, silent witnesses. Even the brisk October wind felt heavier, thick with the scent of wet moss and old perfume. His second night, Samuel heard footsteps moving lightly alongside the edge of the Coleman plot, where most stones were more than a century old. He called out, no response but a sudden coldness more gripping than the chill air. The patrol reports filled with similar occurrences, cameras glitching, batteries draining, radios bursting into static. Never did he catch sight of an actual trespasser, but twice he found red ivy newly coiled in the grass, winding toward other gravestones, always those with deaths marked unsolved. Samuel brought in local historian Marjorie Lane to interpret the photo left at the crypt. She pointed immediately to the style. A studio portrait from the 1940s, the subject a solemn young woman with a dark beauty, her features delicate, immortalized by the photographer's flash. "That's Evelyn Holt," Marjorie said. "She disappeared in 1947, never solved. Her mother always brought flowers, but never ivy. She feared it. The old families all do." "What happened to her?" Samuel pressed. "She was last seen leaving a Halloween dance." "They never found her body," the town whispered, sometimes loudly, about a spurned suitor or about the old curse. There's always been a story of blood in the ivy at Union. Every few years when something ugly happens, the red vines come back. My grandmother said it started over 100 years ago, after a Civil War widow was denied burial for practicing witchcraft. Pattern: cold cases and red ivy. With Marjorie's help, Samuel cross-referenced the crypt vandalism with decades worth of missing person and cold case files. He realized, shocked, that each time the red ivy bloomed out of season, someone in Easton had gone missing, or a body had been discovered in the woods nearby. Usually a Jane Doe never identified. He documented each instance, completing charts, marking patterns on a map. The cycle repeated, always with the same season of blood-streaked leaves, always circling back to graves holding unanswered questions. Deaths left in limbo, families never granted closure. One name kept reappearing: Cora Blake, a local girl vanished in 1978, whose mother had led candlelight vigils at her tomb for years. Her case was eerily similar to Evelyn Holt's. Even the town had whispered about their likeness, as if the curse chose its victims by resemblance or fate. Stranger evidence, Night 5. On the fifth midnight patrol, a thick fog rolled into the cemetery. Samuel's flashlight beam barely pierced the shroud. At the heart of the old graveyard, near the Coleman plot, his radio spat static, and then a distinct whispering voice called out, "Help me rest." He spun. The air tasted cold and coppery, and atop the crypt stood a figure, at first appearing translucent, then unnervingly solid. A young woman, bruise-like shadows under her eyes, an old-fashioned dress stained at the hem. She looked at Samuel and uttered, "You see me, do not," before flickering out like a dying bulb. The only trace she left was a single lock of auburn hair resting atop the photograph in his evidence bag. He collected it, fighting the surreal sense of death and time folding onto itself. Consultation. After-action memo. Samuel wrote up the encounter as unusual but left out the apparition, citing only possible prankster in period costume. Internally, doubt gnawed at him until his next meeting with Marjorie. "It's her," she insisted, voice trembling. "That's Evelyn's hair. Or Cora's. Or the White Lady. They're all the same. When the dead do not rest in union, they beg for justice. The red ivy grows to mark their suffering. This cemetery holds more secrets than bones." He asked her about the curse. Marjorie described generations of blame laid at the feet of an old feud. Two families at war, resolved in a long-ago murder, never forgiven by the town and certainly not by the victims. The legend said the cemetery would remain restless until all wrongs were confessed and remembered. A breakthrough. The confession. Reluctantly, Samuel reopened old files. The Blevins family, whose patriarch was once a respected judge, had blocked town attempts to exhume a suspicious grave placed outside family boundaries, a Jane Doe interred in 1948 with no official ceremony. Samuel visited the grave, marked only MB 1948, and noticed new ivy growing at the base. He contacted a forensic anthropologist in New Haven and, after a week of paperwork and local outrage, secured an order to exhume. Inside the tiny burial, they discovered a skeleton, a blood-stained ribbon, and pieces of glass, consistent with a broken camera flashbulb from the 1940s. Marjorie wept when she saw the evidence. That's Evelyn Holt. The hair, the ribbon, the camera. She was buried here without her name. DNA matched the last living Holt descendant. Samuel drafted his report in terse, clipped lines. Union Cemetery cold case closure. October 29th. Remains confirmed as Evelyn Holt. Family notified. Death ruled homicide. Investigation ongoing for original suspect. Red ivy receded from gravesite overnight. Evidence suggests ritual closure of long-standing pattern. Halloween night. Atonement and release. The town gathered at Union Cemetery under the cautious watch of the police. Marjorie led a candlelit procession among the tombs, reading out the names of those lost, restoring their stories to memory. Local clergy, standing side by side with agnostic townsfolk, read a blessing for each lost soul. Afterward, Detective Hutchins watched from near the Coleman crypt. The ground was still, the red ivy browning and curling away from the stone, returning to its normal green as the sun rose. The townspeople felt the shift. Neighbors spoke about better dreams, quieter nights, and children who stopped waking, shrieking from night terrors. A week later, Samuel was promoted to chief investigator. Not for closing a case officially, but for restoring peace. After-action thoughts. Sam's private log. Samuel told no one about his last midnight round in Union Cemetery. Armed with a lantern, he walked the now peaceful paths. At the Coleman crypt, in fading moonlight, he heard the rustle of leaves. Just nature, he told himself. Yet as he passed the place where the red ivy had once crowned the stones, he caught sight of two silhouettes. Young women in old dresses standing side by side and holding hands. They gazed at him with gratitude, then faded into the mist. He left the photograph of Evelyn on her freshly marked grave with the words she'd written, "I'm sorry. Help me rest." And for the first time, a warm wind swept through Union Cemetery, bearing the scent of roses instead of blood and fear. Union's curse was never spoken of again, but in every October after, someone would spot a flicker of white moving under the maples, hear a voice on the wind, or find an old red bloom curling around a mossy gate. Reminders that forgotten wrongs can linger unless the living have the courage to name them. And so, Detective Hutchins' report closed not on a neat signed sentence but a warning, a nod to future generations. The blood in the ivy at Union Cemetery is not just a stain, it is a message from the silenced. Listen _ The static cut through the October air like fingernails on chalkboard, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Tasha Sinclair adjusted her headset and checked the battery indicator on her body cam for the third time in 10 minutes. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness, capturing every sound, every shadow, every moment of what would become the most disturbing investigation of her paranormal research career. Paranormal Investigation Unit 7, Westminster Hall Cemetery, Baltimore, Maryland, she whispered into her microphone. October 28th, 11:47 p.m. Temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Present team members, myself, Jake Morrison, and David Chen. Behind her, Jake struggled with the infrared camera equipment, cursing under his breath as the tripod legs refused to lock properly on the uneven ground. David stood near the wrought iron fence, electromagnetic field detector in hand, watching the digital readout fluctuate wildly despite the absence of any electrical equipment in the vicinity. "This place is already lighting up like a Christmas tree," David muttered, tapping the EMF detector with his finger. "We're getting readings across the entire spectrum and we haven't even made it past the entrance yet." Westminster Hall and burying ground had been on their list for months. As paranormal investigators specializing in historical hauntings, the team knew the cemetery's reputation well. Dating back to 1786, it was the final resting place of Edgar Allan Poe, whose grave attracted thousands of visitors each year. But it was the other stories, the whispered legends passed down through generations of Baltimore residents, that had brought them here on this cold October night. The screaming skull. "Jake, you getting audio on this?" Tasha asked, adjusting her own equipment as they walked deeper into the cemetery. The ancient headstones rose around them like crooked teeth, some so weathered that the names and dates had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of Maryland weather. "Yeah, everything's recording, but Tash, I'm picking up something weird on the background audio. Listen to this." He rewound 30 seconds of footage and played it back through his headphones, then passed them to Tasha. Through the crackling static, she could hear their own voices, clear and distinct. But underneath, almost subliminal, was something else. A low rhythmic sound that might have been breathing or might have been something trying to speak. "Could be wind through the trees," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "What wind?" David asked, gesturing around them. The air was perfectly still, so quiet they could hear traffic from downtown Baltimore, several miles away. Even the usual night sounds of the city seemed muffled here, as if the cemetery existed in its own pocket of silence. They had done their research thoroughly before coming. The legend of Westminster's screaming, Skull dated back to the 1800s, when a minister named Reverend Samuel Morrison had been found murdered in the cemetery, his body brutally beaten and left among the graves. According to the stories, his skull had been separated from his body during the attack, and for weeks afterward, residents reported hearing screams emanating from the graveyard every night at exactly midnight. The screaming became so disruptive that city officials finally exhumed the minister's remains. They found his skull in a different location from the rest of his body, and local residents swore they could see it moving, jaw opening and closing as if trying to speak. In desperation, they gagged the skull and encased it in a concrete block, which was then placed beside the minister's reconstructed grave. "There," David said, pointing toward the older section of the cemetery. "That's got to be it." About 50 yards ahead, a crude concrete monument stood apart from the more elegant headstones surrounding it. Unlike the carved marble and granite memorials nearby, this was clearly a utilitarian structure, built for containment rather than commemoration. Even from a distance, it seemed to radiate an aura of wrongness that made Tasha's skin crawl. "Temperature just dropped 15 degrees, Jake announced, checking his digital thermometer. "We went from 62 to 47 in the space of about 10 steps. As they approached the concrete block, their equipment began malfunctioning in earnest. The EMF detector's needle shot to maximum and stayed there, while Jake's infrared camera started recording phantom heat signatures, human-shaped warm spots that appeared and disappeared faster than the eye could follow. "Look at this," Tasha said, kneeling beside the monument. The concrete was old and weather-stained, but carved into its surface were deep scratches that looked disturbingly like claw marks. These weren't made by animals. David circled the monument with his camera, documenting every angle. "The scratches are definitely deliberate. Look at the pattern. They're concentrated around what would be the mouth area if this really does contain a skull." "Guys," Jake interrupted, his voice tense. "Check your audio levels." They all fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the ambient city noise filtering through the cemetery. Then gradually they began to hear it, a low, muffled sound coming from somewhere near the concrete block. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but with an undertone of desperation that made it unmistakably human. "Is that—" Tasha began. "Shh." David held up a hand, motioning for complete silence. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the direction of the monument, and it was definitely the sound of something trying to scream through a gag. The rhythm matched that of human speech, rapid, frantic, as if someone was trying desperately to communicate. 11:58, Jake whispered, checking his watch. 2 minutes to midnight. The muffled screaming intensified, becoming so loud that their recording equipment began picking up distortion. Tasha felt her heart hammering as she watched the needle on the EMF detector dance frantically across the entire spectrum. The temperature continued to drop, and their breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. "This is impossible," David said, but his voice shook. "The concrete is 3 inches thick. There's no way sound could carry through that, even if there was something inside." At exactly midnight, the screaming reached a crescendo that made all 3 investigators step back from the monument. The sound was no longer muffled. It was clear, piercing, unmistakably the cry of someone in agony. But more than that, it was trying to form words. "Help!" the voice screamed through what sounded like cloth or rope. "Help me! Find him! Make him pay!" Jake's camera captured it all, the audio, the temperature readings, the electromagnetic spikes. But more importantly, it captured something none of them saw with their naked eyes until they reviewed the footage later. At the moment of the loudest screaming, a translucent figure appeared beside the monument. A man in clerical clothing, his face a mask of rage and pain, pointing frantically toward the newer section of the cemetery. The screaming continued for exactly 3 minutes, then cut off abruptly. The temperature began to rise, their equipment readings returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over them lifted like a weight being removed from their shoulders. "Did you guys see?" Tasha started. "The figure?" "Yeah, I saw it," David said, his face pale. "Jake, please tell me the camera caught that." "Everything's recorded," Jake confirmed, though his hands were trembling as he checked the equipment. Temperature, audio, EMF readings, and whatever the hell that was we just witnessed. They spent another hour in the cemetery documenting everything they could, but the paranormal activity had ceased completely. It was as if the screaming had said everything it needed to say, and the spirit had returned to whatever dark corner of existence it normally occupied. Back at their research facility, they spent days analyzing the footage. The audio was clear and undeniable, the sound of a human voice screaming through a gag, forming recognizable words. The electromagnetic readings showed spikes that couldn't be explained by any natural phenomenon. And the thermal imaging had captured the unmistakable outline of a human figure that appeared and disappeared in perfect synchronization with the screaming. But it was David who made the most disturbing discovery. "I've been researching Reverend Morrison's murder," he told the team during their debriefing session. According to newspaper accounts from 1847, he was investigating financial irregularities in the church. He'd discovered that someone was embezzling money from the collection plates and using it to buy land around the cemetery for development. "So he was killed to keep him quiet," Tasha said. "That's what I thought. But here's the thing. The murder was never solved. The prime suspect was Morrison's assistant, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, but he had an alibi. He was supposedly visiting his sick mother in Philadelphia the night of the murder." David pulled out a manila folder filled with photocopied newspaper clippings and cemetery records. "But I kept digging and I found something interesting. 3 months after Morrison's murder, Blackwood suddenly had enough money to buy a large plot in the newer section of Westminster Cemetery. He built an elaborate mausoleum for himself and his family, even though he was only 35 years old and in perfect health. "You think the figure was pointing toward Blackwood's grave?" Jake said. "I think Reverend Morrison is still trying to identify his killer," David replied. "And I think Jonathan Blackwood got away with murder for almost 200 years. They returned to Westminster Cemetery the following month, this time focusing their investigation on the Blackwood Mausoleum. What they found there would become the subject of their most controversial research paper. Evidence that seemed to suggest the paranormal activity at Westminster wasn't random haunting, but a systematic attempt by the dead to seek justice for unresolved crimes. The screaming skull continued to wail every night at midnight, but now Tasha understood it wasn't screaming in pain. It was screaming for justice, demanding that the truth finally be heard after nearly 2 centuries of silence. And sometimes late at night when the city grew quiet, Baltimore residents still reported hearing those muffled cries echoing from Westminster Cemetery, the voice of a murdered minister who refused to rest until his killer's name was finally spoken aloud. They say the dying see things the living cannot. In my 87 years walking this earth, I never believed such foolishness until Dr. Harrison told me the tumors in my lungs had spread to my spine, my liver, my brain. 3 months, maybe 4 if I was lucky. Time enough to set affairs in order, he said, to say goodbyes. But some goodbyes cannot be spoken to the living. My name is Walter Pennington, Walt to those who knew me before my hair went white and my back bent double. I was born in Knoxville in 1937, raised in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains by a grandmother who claimed she could speak to spirits and a grandfather who dismissed such notions as mountain superstition. I spent my childhood caught between their competing truths, never knowing which to believe until the night I first saw the Watcher. I was 8 years old, walking through Old Gray Cemetery on a dare from Tommy Morrison, and his gang of bullies. The Victorian graveyard sprawled across 45 acres of hills and hollows in East Knoxville, its elaborate monuments and weathered headstones creating a maze of shadows in the moonlight. The older boys had bet me a silver dollar I wouldn't spend an hour alone among the graves after midnight. My family needed that dollar. Times were hard in 1945, and my father had not returned from the war. I entered through the main gate on Broadway, clutching a pocket watch my grandmother had given me. The cemetery felt different at night, alive with whispers I could not quite hear and movement I could not quite see. Every statue seemed to turn its head as I passed. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps on gravel paths. I had made it halfway through my hour when I saw him. He stood beside the Wilder family mausoleum, a figure in clothes that seemed to shimmer between shadow and substance. Tall and gaunt, wearing a long coat that hung from his shoulders like funeral drapes. His face was pale and sharp-featured, with hollow eyes that reflected the moonlight like pools of still water. He was watching me with an expression of profound sadness, as if my presence in that place brought him great pain. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. But instead of approaching or speaking, he simply raised one skeletal hand and pointed toward the cemetery's older section, where the headstones dated back to the 1800s. Then, without a sound, he melted back into the shadows between the tombs. I ran from Old Gray that night, never claiming my silver dollar, never speaking of what I had seen. But as I grew older, I found myself drawn back to the cemetery again and again. During my teenage years, I would walk the winding paths on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly visiting the grave of a distant relative, but really searching for another glimpse of the figure I had come to think of as the Watcher. He appeared to me 7 more times over the decades, always in the same place beside the Wilder mausoleum, always pointing toward the older graves with that same expression of inexplicable sorrow. In 1952, the night before I shipped out for Korea. In 1958, when I returned home to bury my grandmother. In 1963, the week I married my beloved Sarah. In 1971, on the day our son Michael was born. In 1984, when Sarah's cancer finally claimed her. In 1997, at Michael's funeral after the car accident that took him far too young. And most recently, just 6 months ago, on the night I first felt the sharp pain in my chest that would lead to Dr. Harrison's grim diagnosis. Each time I saw the Watcher, something significant happened in my life within days. A departure, a return, a beginning, an ending. He appeared at the threshold moments, the times when one phase of existence gave way to another. I came to understand that he was not trying to frighten me, but to prepare me, to mark the passages that shape a human life. Now, as October rain drums against the windows of my small house on Magnolia Avenue, I know why he has haunted my steps for nearly 80 years. I know where he was pointing all those times, and I know what he was trying to tell me. The older section of Old Gray Cemetery, established in 1850, contains graves that predate the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1854. Hundreds died that summer as the disease swept through Knoxville like a prairie fire, and the cemetery expanded rapidly to accommodate the dead. New plots were laid out in neat rows, modern and efficient compared to the haphazard arrangement of the earlier graves. But in their haste to bury the fever victims, the cemetery planners made a terrible mistake. They built the new section directly over an older burial ground, a small family plot that had been forgotten by everyone except the spirits who dwelt there. The Pennington family plot, my family's plot. I discovered this truth 3 weeks ago while researching my genealogy, hoping to leave my descendants some record of their heritage. Hidden in the basement archives of the Knox County Library, I found a deed dated 1849. Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, had purchased a small parcel of land in what would later become Old Gray Cemetery. The deed described a family burial ground containing the graves of his parents, his wife, and 3 children who had died in infancy. When the yellow fever struck 5 years later, the overwhelmed cemetery authorities apparently lost track of the old family plots. They platted new graves directly over the Pennington burial ground, erecting elaborate Victorian monuments where simple stone markers had once stood. My ancestors were not moved or reinterred. They were simply built over, forgotten, their resting place defiled by the pressing needs of the living. The Watcher was not some random spirit haunting Old Gray Cemetery. He was Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, pointing toward his desecrated family graves and waiting 80 years for one of his descendants to understand his message. Tonight, armed with this knowledge and facing my own approaching end, I returned to Old Gray Cemetery one final time. The October night was cold and damp, with fog rolling off the Tennessee River and settling among the monuments like a burial shroud. I carried with me a bouquet of mountain laurel, Sarah's favorite flower, and a letter I had written to the cemetery authorities documenting my family's rightful claim to the disputed ground. I walked slowly through the familiar paths, my oxygen tank wheeling behind me on its small cart. The elaborate Victorian monuments loomed out of the mist like ships in a ghostly harbor. Angels with weathered faces gazed down at me with expressions of eternal sorrow. Obelisks and crosses reached toward the clouded sky like fingers of the dead grasping for heaven. The Wilder family mausoleum stood unchanged, its granite walls streaked with decades of rain and neglect. I positioned myself beside it and waited, knowing with absolute certainty that the Watcher would come. He materialized from the fog at 11:57, exactly as I remembered him from my childhood. Tall and gaunt in his old-fashioned coat, with hollow eyes that held depths of sadness no living person could fathom. But this time, when our eyes met, I saw recognition in his gaze, understanding, relief. "I know who you are," I whispered into the cold night air. "I know what you've been trying to tell me all these years." Jeremiah Pennington, the Watcher, the shadow that had followed me through 8 decades of life, smiled for the first time. It transformed his gaunt features, making him appear almost human despite his translucent form. He nodded once, slowly, then beckoned for me to follow. Together we walked toward the older section of the cemetery. My steps were labored, my breathing shallow, but I forced myself to keep pace with the spirit of my ancestor. He led me to a cluster of elaborate Victorian graves, monuments to families whose names meant nothing to me now, but who had been buried atop the bones of my people. The Watcher stopped beside a particularly ornate memorial, a marble angel with outstretched wings that had been erected in 1855. He knelt beside the monument and placed his spectral hand against the earth at its base. "Here," he said, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "They are here. All of them, waiting to be remembered." I knelt beside him, my aged joints protesting, and placed the mountain laurel on the ground where he indicated. As I did, I felt them, a stirring in the earth beneath my palms, the presence of souls who had been forgotten for more than a century and a half. "I'll make this right," I promised, pulling out the letter I had written to the cemetery authorities. "They'll know the truth. Your family will be remembered." Jeremiah Pennington rose to his full height and looked down at me with an expression of profound gratitude. The weight of sorrow that had defined his existence for so many years was lifting from his shoulders like fog before the morning sun. "Thank you," he whispered, and in his voice I heard not just his gratitude but that of all the forgotten dead, all the souls whose resting places had been lost to time and human oversight. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern hills, the Watcher began to fade. His form became less substantial with each passing moment, his features blurring into the morning mist. But before he disappeared entirely, he raised his hand one final time, not pointing now, but waving farewell. I sat by that unmarked grave until full daylight, breathing in the autumn air and feeling the pain in my chest ease for the first time in months. The watcher was gone. His vigil finally ended. The weight of his unfinished business had passed to me, but I carried it gladly. I had 3 months to live, maybe 4, and I would use every day to ensure that Jeremiah Pennington and his forgotten family received the recognition they deserved. They found me there the next morning, slumped peacefully against the marble angel, the letter clutched in my lifeless hands. The cemetery groundskeeper said later that my face bore the most serene expression he had ever seen on a dead man, as if I had finally found the peace that had eluded me in life. Old Gray Cemetery is quieter now. Visitors no longer report seeing a gaunt figure watching from the shadows, and the oppressive atmosphere that once clung to the older section has lifted like a curse finally broken. The Pennington family graves have been properly marked and maintained, their story added to the cemetery's official records. But sometimes, on foggy October nights when the veil between worlds grows thin, groundskeepers claim to see 2 figures walking together among the monuments. An old man with a wheeled oxygen tank and a tall figure in an antique coat, no longer separate by death but united in the completion of a task that spanned nearly a century. The watcher's vigil is ended, but the love that bound him to his family and to me endures beyond the grave. The first time Marissa Caldwell saw the little girl in black, she was pushing her twin daughters on the swings at Greenwood Memorial Park in Riverside, California. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October, the kind of perfect Southern California day that makes you forget the summer heat and appreciate the gentle warmth of autumn sunshine. Emma and Sophie, both 6 years old, squealed with delight as their swings carried them higher into the cloudless blue sky. That's when Marissa noticed her standing at the edge of the playground watching. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a formal black dress that seemed oddly old-fashioned, like something from a vintage photograph. The dress had puffy sleeves and a high neckline, with rows of tiny buttons marching up the front like dark pearls. Her long, dark hair was parted severely down the middle and tied back with a black ribbon. But it was her stillness that caught Marissa's attention. She stood perfectly motionless, her pale hands folded in front of her, watching the twins with an expression of profound longing. "Mommy, who's that girl?" Emma asked, pointing toward the strange figure. Marissa looked again, but the child was gone. The edge of the playground was empty except for a maintenance worker trimming hedges near the cemetery gates. "What girl, honey?" Marissa asked, slowing Emma's swing. "The sad girl in the black dress." She was watching us. Sophie nodded vigorously from her own swing. She looked like she wanted to play, but she seemed scared to come over. Marissa scanned the playground again. A few other families were enjoying the morning, parents pushing toddlers on swings, older children racing down slides. But she saw no child in black anywhere. "I don't see anyone, girls." Maybe it was just shadows from the trees. But as they walked back to their car, parked along the service road that separated the playground from Greenwood Cemetery, Marissa found herself glancing over her shoulder. The cemetery stretched across 50 acres of gently rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and filled with headstones dating back to the early 1900s. Many of the older graves belonged to children, victims of diseases that modern medicine had long since conquered. It wasn't until their 3rd visit to the playground that Marissa saw the child herself. She was sitting on a bench near the back fence, the one that offered a clear view of both the playground and the older section of the cemetery beyond. Emma and Sophie were playing on the jungle gym with 2 other children they'd met, their laughter carrying across the warm afternoon air. Marissa was reading a book, occasionally glancing up to check on the girls when movement caught her eye. The child in black sat on a weathered stone bench about 30 yards away, positioned so she could watch the playground through the chain-link fence. She was older than Marissa had initially thought, perhaps 10 or 11, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak branches. Her black dress was even more elaborate than Marissa remembered, with intricate beadwork around the collar and cuffs. But it was the child's expression that made Marissa's breath catch in her throat. The longing was so intense it was almost physical, as if she were pressing her face against glass, desperate to join the other children but unable to cross some invisible barrier. Marissa stood up, intending to walk over and perhaps invite the child to join her daughters at play. But as soon as she took a step forward, the girl looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Marissa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze. The child's eyes were dark and fathomless, filled with a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. For a moment that felt like hours, they stared at each other. Then the girl slowly shook her head as if warning Marissa away, and simply faded like morning mist. Not vanished, faded, becoming more and more transparent until only the empty bench remained. That evening, Marissa called the Riverside County Parks Department to ask about the cemetery next to the playground. The woman who answered the phone was helpful but seemed puzzled by Marissa's questions about children's graves in the older section. "Greenwood's been serving the community since 1908, she explained. "There are thousands of graves there, including quite a few children from the early days when childhood diseases were more common. Is there a specific grave you're looking for? A family member, perhaps?" "No, I was just curious about the history of the area. Has anyone ever reported strange occurrences at the playground? Children seeing things that aren't there?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Well, that's an odd question, but now that you mention it, we do get occasional reports from parents about their kids talking to imaginary friends while playing there. Usually children claiming to see other kids who want to play but never actually join in. The playground's been there since the late 70s, and the reports have been fairly consistent over the years." Marissa felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of reports?" "Oh, nothing harmful. Just children asking their parents about the shy girl or the sad boy they saw watching from near the cemetery fence. Kids have active imaginations, especially in a setting like that. The proximity to the cemetery probably makes them think about ghosts and such." "Have any parents actually seen these children?" Another pause. "Not that I'm aware of. It's always secondhand through the children." But Marissa had seen her, clear as day, solid as any living person, until that final moment when she faded away like a photograph left too long in the sun. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes the child in black would be sitting on the bench watching the playground with that heartbreaking expression of longing. Other times she would be standing near the fence, her fingers wrapped around the chain links as if she were imprisoned behind them. Once Marissa saw her walking slowly along the cemetery's border, always staying in the shadow of the trees, always watching the playing children with those dark, sad eyes. Emma and Sophie seemed to sense her presence too, though they never mentioned seeing her again after that first day. But they began asking questions that made Marissa uncomfortable. "Mommy, why can't some children play with other children?" Emma asked one afternoon as they drove home from the playground. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Some children have to stay by themselves all the time. That's not fair." Sophie nodded solemnly from her car seat. "The sad girl wants to play with us, but something won't let her. She has to stay on the other side." "What other side?" Marissa asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "The quiet side," Sophie said matter-of-factly, "where the sleeping people are." That evening, Marissa drove back to Greenwood Cemetery alone. She parked outside the main gates and walked through the entrance, past the newer sections with their neat rows of modern headstones toward the older area that bordered the playground. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the weathered marble monuments glow like candles. Marissa walked slowly through the older section, reading names and dates, noting how many of the graves belonged to children who had died more than a century ago. She found what she was looking for near a cluster of oak trees that provided a perfect view of the playground beyond the fence. A small headstone, simple and unadorned compared to the elaborate monuments nearby. The inscription was worn but still readable. Helena Rose Blackwood. Beloved daughter, 1902 to 1912. She loved to watch the children play. Below the epitaph was a carving of a little girl in a formal dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, her hands folded primly in front of her. Even rendered in weathered stone, the resemblance to the child Marissa had been seeing was unmistakable. A small American flag had been placed next to the headstone, along with a bouquet of black roses that looked fresh despite the October heat. A brass plaque near the base of the stone provided additional information. Helena Rose Blackwood died of consumption in 1912 at the age of 10. According to family records, she spent her final months bedridden in the family home, watching other children play in the garden below her window. Her greatest wish was to join them, but her illness prevented her from leaving her room. She was buried in this spot specifically because it offered a view of the area where local children gathered to play. Marissa knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cool stone. As she did, she felt a presence beside her, not threatening, but achingly sad. "Hello, Helena," she whispered. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment she saw the child in black standing next to the headstone. But this time, instead of longing, Helena's expression showed gratitude. She smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her pale features, and nodded once before fading away. The next day, Marissa brought Emma and Sophie to the playground as usual, but this time she also brought something extra, a small bouquet of white flowers and a handwritten note. While the girls played, she walked to the cemetery fence and placed the flowers near the spot where she had so often seen Helena watching. The note was simple. For Helena Rose Blackwood. You are remembered. You are not alone. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Emma tugged on Marissa's sleeve. "Mommy, the sad girl isn't sad anymore." "What do you mean, honey?" "She's smiling now," and she waved goodbye. Marissa looked toward the cemetery but saw only sunlight filtering through the oak trees and the gentle movement of branches in the autumn breeze. But somehow she knew that Helena Rose Blackwood's long vigil was finally over. After more than a century of watching from the shadows, she had been seen, acknowledged, and remembered. The child in black was no longer alone.